Parents, the following program is intended for people over the age of 13. If your kids are younger than that, please use the YouTube Kids app.
Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Peter Bernard's Scary Stories for Adults.
Welcome to Scary Stories NYC. I'm your old pal Bigfoot, and I'm Henrey DOGMAN, the far superior storyteller. Welcome to the Scary Stories Best of January DOGMAN special. What is this where you're calling yourself the far superior storyteller? That's a load of baloney. You aren't the far superior storyteller. Yes, I am. I trademarked the term. Nobody else in the world is allowed any longer to bill themselves as the far superior storyteller. It's now mine and mine alone, your old pal Bigfoot. Oh yeah? Well, I'm the far superior storyteller and everybody knows it. Maybe so, but you aren't allowed to call yourself that. Why not? What are you gonna do about it? Well, I would refer the case to my legal team. Legal team, right. Because dogmen understand the law all of a sudden? Oh, I didn't hire a team of dogman lawyers. Do you think I'm dumb? I hired a team of vampires. I see. Well, in that case, sir, you are the far superior storyteller. I thought so. Do you want to start us off with our first story of the special then? Oh, far superior storyteller? Sure, why not? This is a story sent in to us by a fellow from out west who insists that, unlike Bigfoot and me, this story is real. And the title he gave it is The Dogman Outside of My Window. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story that started off being about me getting annoyed as a computer tech on the other side of the planet tried to rip me off for hundreds or thousands of dollars, and ended up with me finding the dogman trying to sneak up on my sleeping pet cat. Trust me, this is all about Dogman, but I have to start off explaining the situation or it won't make any sense. It all started one Saturday in my newly rented home when I got a pop-up ad from my virus protector software. They wanted me to download the new version, so I clicked on their link and was brought to the page for the free download. They were hyping this paid version that cost $9 or $10 a year and supposedly had all these additional benefits added to it. I couldn't really afford it, but the price would be going up by the time I got paid and could afford it, so I decided, what the heck, let me get the $9 version. I paid and so forth, downloaded the thing, and then it told me I had to do what it said in the email they just sent me to unlock the software. I went to my email, and the email said I have to call a phone number. I really didn't want to do that, and I was regretting getting the paid version already. Extremely annoyed, I called the number, and that is when things got extra confusing. This phone call was supposed to just unlock the software I'd paid for, and yet, somehow I got stuck online for what seemed like eternity, and this woman with a thick accent was speaking to me in an archaic manner, like a character from the Mahabharata or something. You have a strong computer. You have a mighty computer. Long will be the reign and legendary the destiny of such a magnificent and remarkable machine. And then, somehow, I had agreed to let her control my computer from her end, and I couldn't figure out what she was doing or why I was letting her. When she started telling me she could fix the invisible dangers inside my mighty computer to grant it a longer and stronger life, it suddenly dawned on me that she was going to try to con me out of a bunch more money. This was all a lot of show business razzle-dazzle to make me feel grateful to pay her more than I already had. Except I didn't have any more than I'd already spent. That was all I could spend. I told her to stop and to return control of my computer to me. Then I began trying to close the programs she was operating and turn off her ability to move my mouse around. She resisted me as I did this, trying to stop me from shutting her out. This was a nightmare. I had only just started my new job, and I was not going to get paid for another 3.5 weeks. My father had lent me all he could, and I knew he was overstretching himself and was dealing with some hardships just to give me what he already had. I didn't have a single penny extra to spend, and if this woman managed to finish her task, she was going to charge me hundreds for something I did not ask her to do. I was panicked on several levels. For one thing, I couldn't let my new coworkers and bosses find out how close to the bone I was cutting it with money at the moment. None of them had risen from working class beginnings as I had, and they already were stretching their credulity to accept me as a novice member of their work group and social class. I needed to draw as little attention to myself, for personal reasons, as possible until I had gotten a couple or 3 paychecks and gotten my feet more solidly on the ground. I don't want to make my new coworkers seem like snobs or anything. It wasn't their fault they were born upper class. Most of us think of the rich as cretins for the way they clearly hold us in such low regard. Like recently, a rich television newsman in America literally mocked the poor and laughed at his straw man portrait of them. He guffawed at how the poor resent his elite class. He called most of the United States stupid. This same man, this same television presenter, had not that long prior asked one of his guests if a missing airliner might have been, quote, swallowed by a black hole, unquote. And yet, he regarded himself as intelligent and the rest of the United States as stupid. But that's my point. It wasn't his fault. That guy probably only talks to other people in his social class, and I would guess compared to them, he probably is the more intelligent one. So he has a diluted sense of reality from living in this tiny fishbowl. But it's not because he's rich. It's because he's living in that bubble. I've actually seen the same effect with poor people who never get out of their tiny neighborhood. One time, I spoke with a family who mocked me wearing my designer business suit to work. I listened to their jeering long enough to grasp that, in their world, expensive clothes were to be worn while celebrating or at events. Work clothes were cheap things you tore off as soon as the 5 o'clock whistle blew. So, to them, I was a weirdo. As my encounter with them ended, they turned to mocking the $1,000 Christian Louboutin pumps that my assistant wore. See, they were snobs too, only in reverse. I started off working class, then I rose to merchant class, but all around me, all the time, I always see people who are locked into their social group forever, often without even realizing that they can, at least sometimes, have a choice in the matter of their own placement in society. At least, we can have a certain amount of control, sometimes, but you can't change your social class if you don't know that's where you are. If you think the group you're in makes sense and everyone else is crazy, then you lack the perspective to be socially mobile. Hence, the rich think you're crazy, you think they're crazy, and you each stay in your own separate worlds. I think we're all crazy, so I at least have the chance to be able to move back and forth between the various worlds. To paraphrase Abby Hoffman during the Chicago 7 trial, there sure are a whole lot of different realities going on around here. My point is, I was aware that I was trying to pull off a magic trick on my colleagues and get them to accept me as one of them. Until my income stream started flowing, though, it was all more trick than magic. For all these reasons, that woman on the phone had me locked in a great deal of fear. If she charged me for anything, my entire charade would be torn down before it started. If she was able to finish what she had started, my future would be in my past. Of course, this was the precise moment that Dogman chose to enter my life. Out of the corner of my eye and through the window, I saw a menacing figure moving across my lawn. It was so alarming a vision that I actually stood up from the life and death battle on my computer, and I walked over to look out the window. There, I saw a man, larger than any I had ever seen. It had massive shoulders and was moving about 3/4 away from me. My first thought was that this was Swamp Thing from the old comic books and movies and so forth, but then I noticed the man had a tail. His legs were oddly shaped as well. This was becoming increasingly unreal what I was seeing, and I remember feeling emotional. I mean, it was upsetting to see. It was something impossible, yet it was right there in my backyard. I wondered if this is what happens when people go insane. The creature turned just a slight bit to its right, and for a moment, I could see its head almost in full profile. It had a dog head. I looked toward where it was headed, and I saw my cat sleeping on top of the brick fence. My beloved cat, my best friend. I opened that window, and I leaned my head out, and I screamed at the dogman to stay away from my cat. I was pretty heated up from the annoying woman on the phone, and I was in full-on fight-or-flight mode, screaming like a complete lunatic. I succeeded in spooking my cat anyway, who leaped in the air and ran off. The dogman, though. The dogman? He just sort of watched the cat run off, then slowly turned and looked at me, hanging out of the window and wagging my finger at him. I watched as he looked at me first blandly, then curiously, and then his eyes grew angry, and he bared his teeth at me. I was already back inside and pulling the window down as the creature walked toward the house. What did I do? I did what anybody would do under the circumstances. I ran back to my computer and recommenced battling over control of my mouse. The dogman was at my window now, screaming at me like a woman having her foot stepped on or something. He sounded just like that, a screeching woman who would occasionally bark and sort of, I guess, snarl. It was terrifying, and I was screaming in fear. It was hard to hold the mouse because my hands were sweating so badly. The woman online was trying to do imaginary repairs. She would charge me more than I owned for, and I needed to get my computer shut down. She was winning the mouse wars, so I pulled my plug out of the wall. Then I remembered this was a laptop and had a battery that could last hours. The dogman banged on my window, and I both heard and saw a crack line open in the glass. I literally evacuated myself right there, and I stood up quickly so as not to ruin my rented chair in my rented house. Pressing the power button on my computer and holding it down, waiting until the machine did its auto shut-off, I saw that dogman literally trying to push its stupid, evil, hungry head through the glass window about 4.5 feet away from me. It was hard to see through crying eyes. With a sobbing voice, I shouted at the computer to please shut off. The second power cut, I was running upstairs. I locked myself into the bathroom up there and listened as the dogman screamed in fury and ranted for a while before disappearing. When my cat returned later that evening, I let him know that was the last time I'd be allowing him outside in that neighborhood. Due to the financial situation I had previously mentioned, we would not be able to afford to move for some time, so that meant Kitty and I were going to have to become indoor people and always remember to lock every door and window. Every hour of every day for the next year, that cat and I were paranoid about what might be outside the house, looking in at us. We kept shades drawn. We didn't get enough sun, and we acted like we had PTSD, the both of us. But I guess you could say it worked because we never actually did see that dogman ever again. We moved after the lease was up, and I've never even thought about the dogman, at least not in the sense of it being an imminent threat in my neighborhood. So that's it. That's the entire story of the time I got menaced by the Dogman outside my window, the hairy Dogman of Hooker, Oklahoma. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a Dogman story for you that goes back a few years, and it didn't take place in the woods. It took place in an area not too different from Bray Road in Michigan, where the whole modern Dogman sightings phenomenon was basically born. Where I ran into the Dogman was along a lonely stretch of highway, going straight down through miles of flat farmland for farther than the eye could see. And unlike that original Dogman sighting, where the creature knelt on the side of the road, eating what it found there, this creature was what I would call extremely antagonistic toward me. It even chased me, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let me explain everything in order from the beginning, so I'm certain you'll understand just how terrifying an experience this was for me. You can't see it, but just typing these words to you gives me goosebumps. This is not going to be easy for me to tell you, as it feels as though I'm reliving it each time I talk about it. I'm not just sending you this email to tell you a cool anecdote. I'm doing it partially as therapy, to get some of the trauma out of my system. I was a full-time truck driver when this happened, and I still drive part-time for my friend's company. This story is about why I had to cut back, to be honest. Not exactly, but mainly. What happened that started all this was I was assigned to be driving a truck carrying a special delivery from San Antonio, Texas, up to Liberal, Kansas. If you aren't from around these parts, you might not know that Liberal is just a wee bit past the northern boundary of the Oklahoma Panhandle, whereas San Antonio is so far south, it's actually south of parts of Mexico. All told, the trip is likely to take you anywhere from 8.5 to 10 hours, depending on traffic. I intended to leave San Antonio around 10 p.m. to arrive at my destination around 7 or 8 to make the delivery. Then I could hopefully make the trip back by 6 or 7 p.m. the next day. I finally did hit the road about 10:45, and I brought a thermos of strong coffee, because that is one long and boring drive. You need to make an extra effort to stay alert on the route, or at least I did. It's a drive I'd rather not make any longer, for reasons that should soon become obvious. Here's an overhead view. Once you get to northern Texas up through Oklahoma, it's just farmland wherever you look, then a small town, then lots more flattened farmland. Where you aren't seeing crop circles, you're seeing crop squares. It can get surreal sometimes driving through flat land with no landmarks, like you're on another planet. It can make you feel like you're either moving super fast, or that you aren't moving at all. Maybe it's just me, but that drive, especially at night, really plays tricks with my mind. One time, I made the drive with the eerie feeling that some UFO or something was watching me from directly above, where I couldn't see it. The sky can seem so large that you almost feel like you're going to get crushed by it, or sucked up into it. I had already created a mixtape of happy and upbeat songs that I used on those long trips to keep things feeling light and mellow, and I was blasting it that evening. I was actually feeling good when it started out. I was in the mood to be alone for a change, and I had high hopes that this would all go easily. After driving most of the length of Texas, I needed to drive through the panhandle of Oklahoma using Route 136 north. Once I got to the town of Guyman, I changed to Route 64 and continued northeast. Eventually, I would pass right through Oklahoma and wind up in Liberal, Kansas. It was a fine plan, as long as nothing went wrong. Just before I got to Hooker, Oklahoma, something went wrong. I could feel it before I could see it. There was someone looking at me, and I sensed trouble the way Spider-Man does in the comic books. My stomach turned, and the mood changed drastically, and instantly I punched the music off. When the mood shift hit, it stopped feeling uplifting and encouraging, and it changed to seem almost mocking. I scanned the 180 degrees I could see in front of me, as well as my mirrors to look behind. At long length, I saw it, off in the distance on the right, to the side of the road. It came over the horizon, yet I knew it had seen me long before I could possibly have seen it. It's hard for me to estimate distance out there, but it was a tiny figure just off the highway. I couldn't make out details, but it was a short person, I thought, possibly a child or a short woman. I continued driving exactly as I had before, but as I drew closer to the dark silhouette, I saw it suddenly grow much taller in height, and I found my foot easing off the gas. I instinctively slowed down, not wanting to let whatever that was get too close to my car. It had stood up, which meant it had to have been squatting or kneeling earlier when I thought it was a short person. Now it looked too tall to even be a person. There are no street lights on that stretch of highway, and it was pretty dark out. There was just, along the eastern horizon, the beginning of a lighter shade of sky, as the sun was just thinking about starting to come up, and so I could see the outline of the incredible tall humanoid, and I could see it holding something in its hand, which it dropped, as it seemed to decide that it was more interested in me and my car for whatever reason. I was so scared of that thing, whatever it was, that I drove up on the middle grass part between the roads, just to be farther away from it. I tried to hit the gas there and speed past it, but it was muddier than I expected, and I only ended up slowing myself down even more. I had to undo this and get back to my right onto the highway, even though it also meant driving closer to whatever that thing was. Turning to the right for just a moment, my headlights lit the entity up, and I clearly saw everything. I saw it from head to foot, and it was unmistakably clear, so I could have no doubt at all what I had seen in that brief moment. I was now driving back on the road toward what seemed to be a large, dog-headed, man-like, caveman thing. Or maybe like a cave bear, but thinner and more humanoid in shape. It stood on animal legs, but in front, it had arms. It reminded me of a centaur, but with only 2 legs and not 4. Or maybe it was like the bull-headed minotaur with something more like a wolf body. And then, of course, there's the obvious comparison. It looked as though it were an upright walking wolf or a werewolf. I know that sounds ridiculous, since werewolves are not recognized as a real species by any country on the entire planet. So, I'm not saying that's what it was. I'm just saying that in that brief moment when my truck's headlights fully lit up that creature, I saw a dark, furred, upright, walking, wolf-like humanoid. It seemed to have large and clawed front paws that reminded me of catcher's mitts used in baseball. If you're not familiar with the sport, Google an image of a catcher's mitt. They are big and round and heavily padded. Imagine that with claws at the end. They can catch most anything thrown at them, and they're built to withstand fierce punishment. I can only imagine its feet were just as impressive and dangerous. I lost sight of the beast as I turned left to put myself in a lane and proceed down the highway. The next thing that happened, I heard and felt a thud sound against the right of my cab. I didn't like the sound of whatever that was. As I stole a glance to my right, I saw something out of a nightmare rear its face from under the window to looking directly and insanely at me. It was a glowing-eyed, furious-looking, demonic, dog-headed monster thing, and I screamed. I probably screamed like a little girl, I have to admit. That was the scariest thing I'd ever seen, and I thought that was the end for me. There was never a scarier jump scare than a real dogman popping up and saying boo outside your passenger seat window while you're driving down the highway a little while before dawn in the middle of an empty farmland. I mean, there was nobody, and I mean nobody, around for as far as the eye could see. We may as well have been on the moon. We were the only characters in this particular story, and he had basically already won. He had me scared, so he had wrested control of the situation from me. The next things I did sprang from that fear reaction, and I'm not necessarily very proud of anything that happened from that point forward in this retelling. I drove that truck faster and faster, hoping to throw the dogman off. If there had been a wall to drive into, I would have tried to throw him off that way, or scrape him off. There was no nobility in my actions. I was only interested in my own survival, and this was because I could tell from the intensely hateful look in the glowing eyes of that beast that the dogman was interested in terminating my survival. It was either him or me. There was no other traffic out. There was nothing but the road and the muddy grass and farmland surrounding it. I knew that I would be heading into Hooker, Oklahoma soon, and I wanted to stop there to get a Mr. Burger breakfast. What would I do if I hit the town and the monster was still clinging to my side door? Would I keep driving? If I stopped and there was a feral dogman outside, wouldn't I be trapping myself in my own cab, as well as creating a danger for the people of the town? I drove that truck more furiously than I should have, left and right and left, and at points I could feel wheels leaving the ground. We almost tipped over at one point, but when we righted ourselves, we did it with such a shaking, slamming shudder that I saw the dogman lose his grip and disappear somewhere behind us. Success! I had shaken him off. Now I just needed to get to Hooker and get myself a Mr. Burger and try to calm down. Except that dogman was not done with me yet. I absolutely couldn't believe what I was seeing, but that thing was up and running after me. I tried to calculate how fast it was running, but before I could, it dropped to all fours and started running exponentially faster. I was in deep poo-poo. Once again, I tried to calculate how fast it was going as I sped up to the max that the truck could handle. I wouldn't have even minded if the cops caught me speeding, because I really would have loved having armed law enforcement there at that particular moment. It would have been an awful lot better than being completely alone as I was. I started feeling sorry for myself, and I began to feel hopeless. I told myself it was because I was tired, and I blocked off those feelings of weakness. I became my foot on the gas pedal, and I became my hands on the steering wheel. I had to outdistance that creature before I reached the town, or I might be the cause of something terrible. Pulling into Hooker, Oklahoma, one of the first and most beautiful sights you will see is Mr. Burger. The thing is, this time I pulled up to it and it didn't seem to be open yet. My watch said it was a few minutes before 6 a.m. Then I saw on the door that it is scheduled to open at 6 a.m. I was just a bit too early. I looked down the road behind me and couldn't see the dogman coming into view yet. I prayed that he had given up the chase somewhere back there. I was about to try to wait till 6 when I saw the guy setting the place up to open, and I banged on the window. He made a motion toward the clock and shook his head. I resigned myself to my fate, then looked back at the highway. The dogman. It was back on its hind legs and it was trotting along, but that was definitely it, and it was apparently about to make its way into the town. Banging furiously on the window and looking desperate, I begged the guy inside to please let me in. I looked down that road and I could see the dogman headed straight for me. I banged harder and begged the guy more. Then I pointed down the road toward the monster and tried to look as scared as I felt. He came over to the door, annoyed, and opened it. "I told you we aren't open for another," the dogman barked loudly as he saw the proprietor's face sticking out of the door. Looking to his right, the man saw the dogman, and his jaw dropped to the floor. I slid past him, then pulled his shocked, stiffened body back into the restaurant before closing and locking that door behind us. Looking at the front, I couldn't see the dogman from that angle. I knew he might still be somewhat far away, but he might be just around the corner, ready to stick his face in the window and bark and growl at me. I waited, nervously, never knowing when the feral animal man would arrive and resume his nightmarish torment of me. The guy who worked at the restaurant, he and I both stood there, looking out the front windows of the place till nearly 6:20 a.m., but we never did see the creature approach the building from our vantage point. When his tardy waitress and the customers started arriving a few minutes after that, we both quizzed each of them as they came in about whether or not they had seen anything strange when they drove up. They all looked at us like we were crazy, which was very reassuring. After all, if they saw nothing strange, then it meant that the dogman must have gone away. The sun had completely come up, and with the sun comes a new day, so I resumed my delivery and didn't see the creature the rest of the way. I felt like getting a hotel room and sleeping 12 hours before heading back, but I knew that wasn't an option. My main goal on the return trip would just be to stay awake and obey traffic regulations. After that dogman situation, I felt the return trip would be a cakewalk, and basically it was. I can't explain how eager I was to get home before it grew dark and to sleep in my own bed that night. After a good night's sleep, I found that I didn't really feel better about the whole thing. Somehow, I actually felt worse. It was like some new mental block had been placed in my mind and in my heart. I had a deathly fear of the farmland which made no logical sense. I have forced myself to drive it several times since, just to prove to myself that I could face my own fears. But I don't accept jobs driving up that way any longer. One of my buddies who drives rigs laughs at me because of this. He says the farmland is the least scary place on the planet because you can see anything coming at you from a mile off. He hates driving through forests or cities. He says in places like that, there are more hiding spots for bad guys to pop out at you. He also likes to kid me that I thought I was attacked by a dog-headed monster man, but there are no places around that area for such an animal to even live. Who knows how far it is to the nearest woodland from there? I don't. He said that what I told him happened must have been my imagination. I wondered if he could be right. I wondered if the endless farmland had played with my mind and manufactured a fake werewolf just to fill in the blanks created by the boredom and the repetition of the landscape. But then I remembered the look on the face of that restaurant keeper. I remember how his eyes went blank and his jaw fell wide open when he saw what had been chasing me. Now, if he saw it, then I didn't imagine it, but that doesn't mean I can explain it. Even to me, this story seems a bit improbable. How did the dogman get to that road? Where had it come from? It would seem like it couldn't possibly have happened except, like I said, the location of the original Bray Road dogman sightings in Michigan was just the same. Flat farmlands all around. So, what is the dogman really? Where does it come from? And where does it go to? How can something that seems like it walked out of a nightmare actually be real? And will we ever learn the real facts behind the hairy dogman of Hooker, Oklahoma? Before we begin, I'd like to announce that today's episode is executive produced by Timothy S., The Trapper. Thank you, Timothy. We couldn't do these shows without you and the other members of our paid subscribers club. If you out there would like to become the executive producer of one of our shows, just become a paid subscriber at peterbernard.com. This next story we've got today is a bit surreal in places, as the person who sent this in to us still isn't exactly sure what the werewolf he encountered was. I mean, yes, it was a werewolf, but what is a werewolf after all? If I get confused at points during the narration, don't blame the author, blame the cold medication I'm still taking. I've been overdosing on vitamin C, and one of you suggested I switch my diet to the carnivore diet. I did try to eat only carnivores, but I've discovered they're harder to catch than herbivores, so I've switched back to vitamin C and the store brand version of Contact. My plan is to just never speak all day except when I'm reading stories to you guys, then everything should be fine. Or at least we can pretend it is. So, how did you like the story? Oh wait, I haven't read it yet. Well, get ready for a good and scary one. And don't worry, it makes more sense than I do. Dim your lights. Burn some spooky incense. Do what you need to do to prepare yourself for a scary little yarn. And let's get started right now. The Werewolf of Route 130. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am abnormal and I'm admitting it right up front before I tell you anything else. I used to be normal, at least relatively so. I used to be a werewolf fan. I loved Werewolf by Night comic books. I loved old Lon Chaney movies. I used to venture to motion picture theaters in other states to catch rare foreign werewolf films. When VHS came into existence, I did my best to collect every Wolfman and werewolf film that had ever been made. And, as a good and normal werewolf fan, I thought that people who claimed werewolves were real were batty and not to be taken seriously. It's traditional to feel that way if you are a fan of any particular genre of fiction, not just werewolf movies and culture. Science fiction fans were informed by their leaders like Ray Bradbury that UFOs were not real. You either thought that fiction could never cross over into reality, or you would not be taken seriously by many fans of that type of fiction. There is a similar phenomenon where people who believe in UFOs won't, or wouldn't back then at least, admit to believing in Bigfoot or anything else. Bigfoot believers in turn would laugh at UFO fans and fail to report Bigfoot sightings that also included reports of strange lights or flying craft. It was all very tribal and possibly still is in some cases, and I was a good tribe member. I worshipped my Wolfman movies, and I felt safe that such a thing could never exist in real life. Of course, I had heard the reports of the so-called real-life werewolves. I had seen them in magazines and on TV, heard their cases told. To me, they were just crazy people. They did not physically transform into animals, they just decided to behave like animals. If people want to say that's werewolfism, then it sort of proves that there really is no such thing, at least in my opinion. Like the more recent reports of so-called Wendigos, those stories just seem like horrific cases of severe mental illness, not something that would be in any way supernatural. But, well, what I know, I was just a werewolf fiction fan after all, not an expert on real-life monsters. Now, obviously I wouldn't be telling you all this unless something happened to change my mind about these subjects. Not only did this event I'm about to describe change my mind about werewolves, this event changed my personality in general, changed my entire group of friends, cost me my old job, and turned my life in a completely different direction. I am no longer the person I was before this happened, but I'm not complaining. This was the most frightening and traumatic thing I can imagine happening to me, and I thought it was going to be my final story. I didn't expect to still even be alive to tell you about it. It genuinely feels like I'm living on borrowed time ever since then, and so, as painful as it is for me to relive these events in my mind, I do want to write down the details, at least in this anonymous form. Those who know me would be able to tell quickly that it's me, but I don't mention any of them by name, so I hope none of them out me. I had gone into Manhattan to see a double feature of werewolf movies, but I don't remember the titles and I'm not 100% sure of the theater, although I feel almost certain it was the old Thalia Theater in Manhattan. I don't mean the current Leonard Nimoy Thalia, the rebuilt version on the same block. I mean the weird old Thalia. It was slanted backward inside, so the seats toward the back were down lower than the seats in the front by the screen. It felt like you were sitting in a rocket ship waiting to take off. I loved that place. It was where I saw double features of old, almost lost films made by Edward D. Wood Jr. I saw the Monkees movie Head there, and I saw Otto Preminger's comedy about Jackie Gleason from The Honeymooners going on an acid trip there, and I learned more about the history of motion pictures in that location than I had from any book I'd read or class I had taken. That was the closest thing to heaven for me in those days, the Thalia Theater on West 95th Street in Manhattan. The bad part of going to the place for me was the long drive there, the hassle of trying to find a parking spot, negotiating to be allowed back in if I had to go put more money in a parking meter, and then the long 2-hour drive home. I lived in New Jersey, which is technically right over the river from that part of Manhattan. The trouble was, the part of New Jersey I lived in was closer to Philadelphia than the Upper West Side. You see, I lived in Voorhees. That's not where the story takes place, though. It takes place on the way back to Voorhees, in the dark, at night. I would normally take Route 95 most of the way south to get home, but traffic was ridiculous and I didn't have GPS in those days, so I took a wild guess and got off the highway at some point. I don't remember exactly how, but I ended up on Route 130, and I was over sort of by Pigeon Swamp, but not exactly. It was a stretch of the road with a lot of trees to my right. Of that, I'm 100% certain. I sent you a screen grab of approximately where it took place, although you have to keep in mind that this was in the dark of night, and there was no other traffic on the road. I think everyone else was still stuck back on 95. I was quite proud of myself, having gone from a near standstill on the big highway to my own little private highway. I thought of how much better time I was making than everyone else, and I was in a good mood. Then, the car started sputtering, and I couldn't believe it was slowing down. I looked at my dashboard and I discovered that I'd been so excited about my Wolfman double feature that I had neglected to gas up before the drive home. It costs a lot more for gas in Manhattan, so I made a mental note to stop once I got through the tunnel. But the bad traffic totally distracted me from that mental note. My face grew red because I still lived with my parents back then, and I knew I would have to tell them the truth about why I was going to be home late. I also knew they would make fun of me for it. Well, my father would mock me, but my mother would just give me that disapproving and disappointed look for most of the next 2 months, probably. I knew I would deserve it, too. It was a dumb kid's mistake, and I was over 21. I should have moved out already, that's what they kept telling me. All my friends were out on their own. I was going to get a lecture about how I needed to grow up and stop watching monster movies. I needed to become responsible. I needed to get my feet on the ground. I needed to become a man. I knew what was coming, and so as to save time, I started beating myself up internally before either of them even knew what had happened. All right, there I was. It was the mid-1980s, and I had pulled off my private little highway, maybe a mile short of the motor vehicle department building. Was there a gas station over there? I tried to visualize it so I could remember, but I was drawing a blank. In fact, there is one a bit past there, although it was some other brand back then than the brand it is now. I had a long walk in front of me and I didn't really want to do it. I just wanted to feel sorry for myself instead. I began procrastinating by doing things such as counting the money I had in my pocket, even though I knew exactly how much I had remaining. We used to use cash back in those days, I don't know if you remember. Then, I checked to make sure I had change for the phone to call my parents and alert them to prepare their speeches. We used to use payphones back in those days. I looked around for something else to do besides what I had to do, and I couldn't find a thing, so I breathed a big self-pitying sigh, and I got out of the vehicle to open the trunk and take out my emergency gas container that I would need to fill up. I knew the drill. I had done this to myself once before. I had sworn that night to never let this happen to me again, but on this second night, I resigned myself to the notion that my parents were correct, and for me to prevent this kind of idiocy from recurring, it was time to throw out the werewolf models on the shelves in my room, and for me to start acting like a grown-up. I had enjoyed the exotic, rare werewolf double feature I had seen that day, and it would have to hold me. No more werewolf movies or collectibles until after I had gotten a job, which paid enough that I could move out. Then, I'd let myself see one movie as a reward. After that, no more Wolfman until I actually had moved out. I could watch a monster flick as a reward after I'd gotten my own place. I would need to discipline myself or else I was never going to lead a normal adult life. It made me feel better to create my own plans for the future than to wait to have one imposed on me by my parents. It also helped me feel less down on myself because I knew I was taking steps to improve things. Gas canister in hand, I went trudging like a loser down that road. I felt like an idiot because I was an idiot. I was so deeply lost in my own self-misery that I didn't even notice I was being followed until a car drove past me from behind, beeping his horn like a crazy person. At first I thought that maybe I could get a ride from the guy, but he didn't slow down at all when he passed. I looked in the car at him, and his eyes were wild. He was pointing in a way that indicated I should look behind myself, so I did. What I saw then is what all this has been leading toward. What I saw then changed my life. What I saw then was a monster. There was a very tall, hairy man there, not very far from me at all. It wasn't a man in costume. It was an animal mostly covered in fur but standing up like a man. Parts of its fur were worn away, revealing blemishes and healing injuries, and from where I was standing, it was no effort at all to be certain it was a male, with all of its original equipment intact as far as that went. It was not Lon Chaney or even Paul Naschy. It was not wearing human clothing. It was a creature, a beast, an animal. I didn't think it was a werewolf because, to me, werewolves were not real, as I'd already explained. But the main reason I didn't think of it as a werewolf might sound really funny to you. It was because its head looked so much like a wolf's head. I don't want to say that the creature had a wolf head exactly. I just want to say it had a wolf-like head. This creature had bright eye shine, even though there was not much light in the area. It wasn't possible for me to look long at the eyes. It hurt mine, but I did look the creature over. I wouldn't say it was as muscular as the more recent sightings I read about online. It was not the Hulk or Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was just as frightening to me, though, because it was taller than I was and its arms seemed to stretch down past its knees. I've read the literature on dogmen and werewolves ever since then, and I'm familiar with Linda Godfrey's writing on the subject. She describes the dogmen walking with their paws held in front of them in almost a praying position, or maybe like a praying mantis. This thing was not doing anything like that. Its front legs looked like the arms of a basketball player, strong but long. Its front paws were so huge that they were more like hands, and I can actually imagine it holding a basketball in just one of them. I don't remember anything but looking at the thing. I don't think I was really able to do anything else. At first, the creature seemed as confused and amazed by me as I was by it. I wondered where it had come from that it would never have seen an idiot in person before. Eventually, it made up its mind about me, and it decided I was something it was mad at. Very quickly and with no warning, the tall monster bent at the knees and the waist and stuck its face directly into mine, and then bared its teeth, which seemed taller than my entire head. I was reminded more of that scene in that early Alien movie where she sees the creature's teeth and the slime drips off them. This was more like that than a scene from a werewolf picture. I could now smell the thing's breath, and I was tasting metal in my mouth. I could feel that I was about to be in a whole lot of pain, and I came out of my confusion to witness a beautiful, full-color display of everything that had ever happened to me. I admit I had some regrets watching my life play back, but for the most part, I really enjoyed the instant replay. Then, it was over, and I was back, there, inches away from the end of the snout of something that didn't like me very much. I have been told by people that what I saw was a hallucination, but in that moment standing there, I watched each of the creature's hairs blow in the breeze. If this was coming from my mind, then my mind should get a job as a 3D animator, because this sure looked and smelled extremely lifelike. The monster was clearly about to pounce, and I was having a hard time preventing myself from fainting. Before anything else could happen, though, the loud sound of a siren made us both jump. I looked behind and saw a police car approaching in the opposite lane, driving across the grass intersection between the two highways. Its flashing lights were going crazy on top. It drove up quickly and came to a screeching halt. Two officers burst out of the sides holding their weapons covered behind their car doors and shouting orders that I was too in shock to comprehend. Then, inexplicably, they dropped their arms and stared off into the woods past me. I turned around again, and the dogman was gone. He must have run into the trees, and the officers must have wisely chosen not to pursue. It was one male officer and one woman, and the woman was acting like good cop. In my delirious state, I thought that meant I was under arrest. She was very mothering to me, and she noticed the gas canister still in my right hand, even after all that. I remember being on a payphone at a gas station and being unable to form sentences. I remember the lady cop taking the phone away from me to explain the situation to my mother, or maybe my father. I remember spending a few days in bed before really starting to remember who I was and what I was supposed to be doing. It really shocked my whole mind out of me. I kind of understood that it didn't even matter anymore who I used to be. It didn't matter who I was friends with, and it didn't matter what job I had. It mattered more who I was going to choose to become. The old way hadn't led anywhere. I was wasting time on idle entertainment when every moment the dogman was waiting for me, waiting to end everything. I guess I mean that figuratively. Death is always over our left shoulder chasing us. But I met a real-life dogman, and he took the opportunity to remind me that he is always there, and he always will be, at least until he catches me, and that will be all she wrote. The reason I was always obsessed with werewolf literature and film has to have been related to that. It has to have been a part of me trying to wake myself up to life while there's still time. Now I watch those kinds of films far less frequently than I used to, but with no less passion than before, because now I feel I know what they all mean. The werewolves of the world, the dogman lurking in the darkness, they are our own demise, and they are following us wherever we go. That's the lesson I learned from the werewolf of Route 130. I'm Henry Lee Dogman, and before we get to this very special wintertime Dogman story, I want to announce that this next tale is executive produced by Sexy Kojak. Thank you, executive producer Sexy Kojak. We couldn't have done it without you. If you'd like to be a Scary Stories executive producer yourself, just become a member of our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Now, as a dogman, people think I hibernate through winter. That's because they also think I'm a bear with mange. In actuality, my people are quite active all winter, hunting, playing, and frightening weary travelers, as in this next tale that we like to call Dogman and the Snowy Day. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story about Dogman that happened to me personally. It was a day that started off really fun and magical, then turned into a truly horrific scene that almost got way too far out of control. I'm just gonna jump right in. It's a pretty straightforward narrative, nothing complicated here. This was back when I was still in college and I had taken the bus to go home to my family for the holidays. The ride had taken over a full day, and I find it hard to sleep on those things, so I was pretty beat up by the time we pulled into the station closest to my hometown in rural Pennsylvania. Once I got out of the bus, the coldness woke me up, and it began to snow. Suddenly, it was as though I had just slept 12 hours. I felt so refreshed and excited to be alive. I told my parents I wasn't going to be able to make their holiday celebration, so this was going to be a surprise for everyone. The town was about a 40-minute walk from the bus station, and I decided it would be more fun to walk home and take everyone completely unexpectedly. I don't know why I did any of that. I guess it just seemed like it would be the fun thing to do that year. I had never actually made that walk home from the bus station before. I had always gotten a lift, but I had studied a map before I left, and I made notes on a piece of paper I had in my pants pocket. I had drawn out which blocks to turn on, and I also had written down the names of the next few blocks past each turn, in case I missed any of them. There was a long stretch on a block that would have houses to my left and forest to my right. The forest went on for miles and miles. I remember getting sidetracked looking at how big those woods were. I had never really noticed them or been aware of their existence as just something to drive by, yet I'd lived a half hour away for most of my life. The map didn't have a name for those woods. I guess it was just land that nobody had cut down and made use of yet or something. It seemed most of the places we consider wilderness as humans are actually the parts of the wilderness that we've installed ranger stations on. There can sometimes exist, within our midst, land in and around our towns that we almost never think about, which might actually be more truly wild and natural areas. I'm not trying to sound deep or profound because I don't think I'm even capable of either, but I'm trying to say that I was pondering those thoughts for the entire ride out. I would look out the windows at the trees going by, wondering which of the forests had names and which had been designated as wildlife protection areas and which ones were set aside for hunting. I also wondered which of the trees I was seeing were situated on land which, at least for now, had fallen through the cracks of human interest, which were on land that people had not given names to yet, land that we hadn't put our own use and purposes to yet. As I grew more tired on the trip, I began to wonder what the real difference was anyway. We don't see what's there. We see the labels we've placed on things. We don't see nature as it exists. We see Yosemite National Park TM or whatever. We see the brand name and not the actuality beneath the imaginary description. So anyway, I was in that kind of a state of mind, very aware and conscious of just observing and noting what was happening around me, not placing judgments and titles or explanations wherever I was looking. That was why the irony of writing down the street names to prevent myself from getting lost seemed humorous and ironic to me at the moment. I discovered, though, that it was easier to find my way by appreciating the uniqueness of each block as I encountered it. I was not only noting the street names, but I was seeing the places themselves. I would be able to find my way back by landmarks more than by street signs. I later found out that what was going on is that I had accidentally begun to discover Zen. But back on that day, all I knew was that it felt absolutely wonderful to be there in that place, and even the ugly parts seemed special and beyond beautiful. Sorry if I sound like I'm tripping. Maybe I was a little bit due to the tiredness and the cold weather. I was so happy to be walking home in the snow, and I imagined each snowflake being different, even though they looked the same to me. If my bag over my shoulder hadn't been so heavy, I think I would have been dancing most of the way. I finally reached the forested area as the snow started falling much harder than before. There was garbage all over the ground. I had forgotten that this was the bad side of town. I looked across the street, and it looked like most of the houses on the block had been abandoned. I felt an extra chill go through me, separate from the weather. Poverty and filth were frightening me and pulling me from my Zen state. I was clearly still a newbie at it. My Christmas mood was draining away as I considered how many would not have a good holiday, how many would starve or freeze. Aside from empathy for others, I became aware that I, myself, might be walking into a dangerous situation. I pulled out my little hand-drawn map and studied it. There were the equivalent of 4 more blocks of forest, then 1 block of stores, then another 4 blocks of trees on the right. I tried to see how far it was going to be in real life, squinting ahead of me, but the snow was now coming down so hard that I could only see about a half a block in front. Let's do this, I urged myself, and I put my head down and got to work, making the long trek home. My foot slipped on something and I almost turned my ankle. I had been walking in silence for some time, my head facing down, with the wind blowing harshly in my face, pushing back against me. What had I almost tripped on? I bent down, trying to see through the fierce white snowfall. It was a rock. I was standing on dirt, not the sidewalk. I stood up and looked around, but I could not make out where the street even was. I seemed to have wandered into the trees, and I needed to get back on concrete immediately before I really got lost. Every direction I looked in seemed the same as all the others. Look for lights, I thought to myself. Lights mean civilization. That made sense in my mind, so that's what I did. I spun around, seeing nothing that looked like artificial light, until I saw them. 2 yellow lights, off in the distance. I didn't know what they were, but I saw that they were lights, and I set off walking toward them. They were small, and they were placed closely together. I couldn't imagine what exactly I was seeing. They weren't streetlights because they were side to side, not on top of each other. I felt joyful, however, because this was a mystery I was certain I was about to solve. I really enjoy solving mysteries. It's why I'm good at math. I have a compulsion to solve problems and equations. As I drew closer to these small yellow lights, however, I only grew more confused, as they resembled nothing I had ever seen before. And then they moved. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw the lights move toward me. I heard trees and bushes being walked through, and I saw the lights approaching as though they were walking toward me. I saw the bright yellow lights blink. These were eyes. This was animal eye shine. I was staring up in the air at some incredibly tall animal, and it was staring back through the snow at me. The winds gusted and swirled, and the snow with it, creating areas in which I could see more clearly. And what I was able to see through squinting eyes, standing in front of me in the 21st century, was some sort of hairy, animalistic caveman. I say caveman because its long body fur was blowing up left, right, and all around, revealing its intense musculature, which was very much like that of what we would call a caveman. It had a broad, muscular, human-like chest, but it wasn't exactly human, sort of proto-human. It did not have a caveman face, though. It had a face like one of those animal-headed men from ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. What I mean is, it was like a man with the head of a jackal or a dog or a wolf, but an insane-looking one. It looked familiar but strange and unfamiliar at the same time. I guess the easy cop-out would be for me to just say it was a dogman or a werewolf, and maybe it was. I'm trying to be more specific, though, and not use old labels to describe something that seemed so new to me. It was a thing I wish I could show you images or video of rather than use words to describe, because we all have images attached to words in the dictionaries of our brains. If I say Bigfoot, you have an image instantly in your mind. Probably the same with words like dogman or werewolf. Some of you may be into the subject enough to even know what I meant if I talked about the different types of dogman. But none of that would be communicating to you the strange thing that I saw through the snow on that day. The other aspect of all this is that I can't actually say that I know what I encountered there. It was so completely out of place and so utterly unexpected that I would think people would come up with their own decisions as to what I saw, each of them entirely different from everyone else's guess or assumption. A skeptic from Psycop would have one answer. A Dogman fan would have another answer. A person from Fish and Game might say it was a bear. A person teaching improv at the local comedy club might assume it was someone in a costume pulling a prank. New Age individuals might wonder if I had encountered a nature spirit. UFO buffs might suggest I met an alien from outer space or from another dimension. So, what was that there in front of me? First of all, it looked supernatural to me, but probably for very natural reasons, and therefore I felt an extra sense of awe and horror in its presence. The way the wind was blowing its hair all over, and it was alternately covered in snow, or else very clearly visible, as the wind alternately covered it then blew its wet hair away to reveal the epidermis underneath. Everything I was seeing was bleached by the intensity of the snowfall and the gusting winds, but I still feel it would be safe to say the creature had pale skin under a very dark fur covering. It was intensely humanoid outside of its face. Another comparison I might make would be to the band Gwar, like a broad-chested man with a strange wolf head on top. Gwar is exaggerated, obviously, but I'm struggling to try to communicate what it felt like in that moment. I think I would have been just as scared if it had been a bear the same size standing there, but I don't think I would have been as awed. The way this thing stood there and walked slowly toward me, I wasn't sure that it was actually real in the day-to-day kind of way. I wondered if it might be what people call a demon, and in all honesty, I can't rule that out. Of course, Now we're back to labeling things instead of trying to understand them. On that day, I was mainly focused on the upper half of the creature, and I didn't really notice the legs. I can't honestly remember if they were in my line of vision or not anyway. The visibility was very low and memory fades. I think there might have been low bushes between us as it approached. I do know that in my dreams I've had about it since then, it always walks on backward bent hairy legs, much like devils and Goatman and Dogman and other alleged monsters reported to be lurking out there somewhere. I kind of feel that's what its legs were like, but I don't have any conscious direct memories of that, so I can't say for certain. I'm trying to be very specific here. It did have front arms like a man, but hairy, and its hands were very much like paws or claws, but with longer fingers and arranged more like human hands. It didn't look like a human hand exactly, it looked like a mix between a man and an animal. The underside of the paws or hands did appear darker than the rest of the creature's skin, as did the end of the nose. Both were darker and leathery. I remember that it seemed to possess an intelligence and an intensity that was different from a normal dog, but it made facial expressions that were very dog-like, not human at all. I couldn't get a fix on how much intelligence it might possess or what kind of intelligence. It was able to stare at me for great periods of time, only blinking occasionally, even in the heavy snow. It did not have its tongue hanging out of its mouth like most dogs do, and that added to my confusion about it. In fact, the only time I even saw its teeth was after it seemed to finish staring at me, and it changed its demeanor entirely to one that was far more threatening. It seemed very agitated, and looked as though it were ready to pounce. Its face adopted alarmed eyes, and its lips curled back to reveal the teeth of a carnivore gleaming back at me through the dark. I almost felt as though my knees were going to give out on me when it really leaned into a nasty expression and began to growl, loud enough that I could hear it over the roaring wind. I took a step back, then another. I wanted to run, but I didn't think I could outrun this dog-headed caveman, especially if it were able to run on all fours, as I expected it probably could. If you've ever seen chimps on video left to themselves, they'll sit around doing rude things most of the day, but once in a while, when they really want to, they are capable of bursts of speed so incredible that it's nothing humans would ever be able to compete with. I don't think my brain would be able to think fast enough to get away, even if I were wearing Iron Man's outfit. This is because chimps can drop to all fours and really motor. I was looking at that, whatever it was, in front of me, and it sure looked like it could do 40 miles an hour if it needed to. I mean, gray wolves can run 30, can't they? This was much larger, and my mind was racing for a way to get out of this mess I had gotten myself into. I mean, my family didn't even know I was coming. If something happened to me in this forest, I might be there for a week before anyone even noticed I was gone. I was in a very bad situation, and I had to prevent it from getting any worse. On my third step backward, I noticed the creature man becoming less agitated than before. I risked slightly speeding up my backstepping, and it seemed less agitated still. I began retreating in a more normal sense, occasionally checking back to see that he was still watching me with those glowing eyes, but he was allowing me to retreat. I was looking behind me and I tripped and fell hard onto the sidewalk. I got up and looked around, seeing that I had nearly made it to the north corner of the first 4-block expanse of forest. My heart was beating pretty hard, and I crossed the street, hoping that one of the stores on the next block would be open so I could catch my breath before making the rest of my trip home. As luck would have it, there was actually a taxicab headquarters there, so I hired one of them to drive me home royally. Those were the days before Uber, obviously. So I made it home wet and cold, but in one piece. It was awesome to be welcomed back by everyone, but I have to say I had been shocked a bit out of my Christmas spirit by my frightening experience in the forest there. It wasn't till I had slept on it that I began to wonder if the dogman was only growling at me to keep me from getting further lost in his world. Maybe he was just trying to scare me back to my own, get me back on my path. Not necessarily for noble reasons, but maybe it had offspring a bit further in the woods that it didn't want me to come across. Or maybe it had food it was guarding, or who knows what else. Maybe this, maybe that. I can't really know what the motivation was, since I don't know what I was actually witnessing. For a few years, I saw a therapist, and she was convinced that the dogman I saw was a projection of my subconscious, warning me that I was heading in the wrong direction. That seems so complicated to me, it almost seems easier to believe it was a real animal. But she said my subconscious mind would have noted immediately when I headed off the sidewalk, even though my conscious mind missed it entirely. It therefore would have known exactly the direction I needed to head in, and that's where I happened to go. I'm glad she feels like she understands what happened to me, because I still can't be so sure. And that's about all I can tell you about the Dogman and the snowy day. Today's episode is executive produced by Mark M. If you'd like to be executive producer of one of our episodes, just join our paid subscribers club over at peterbernard.com. Today we've got not one but two scary Dogman stories for you. Let's call it 2 for Tuesday Dogman. Without further ado, let's jump straight into the first one, which we call 3 Mile Island Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I grew up in Pennsylvania in the shadow of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. They had a big accident there before my time, and all of my generation in the late 80s and early 90s were very aware of it. Almost all of my friends had told me they saw mutant monsters in the area around there, and we had all sorts of campfire stories and urban legends about nuclear radiation creating mutations and monsters which lived all around us and underground in caverns all through the area. As I grew up, nearly every friend and family member I had told me their story of what they had seen in that area of the world. My buddy Rob told me that he saw a man-like monster with lizard-like skin. It was grayish-green, scaly, and had spikes sticking up out of its back. I forget if he said it was wearing clothes like a man or if it seemed more like an animal. We got both kinds. This girl in my school whose name evades me told me that it wasn't just animals who got mutated by the power plant. It was humans, too. She felt that way because supposedly she had seen a monster walking along wearing jeans or slacks or something. Men's pants, basically. It was a hairy, topless, ape-looking creature like a juvenile Sasquatch, yet it was wearing pants, which led her to think that it had at one time been a man until the radiation changed him. I remember suggesting to her that it might have also been a shapeshifter that she had seen, possibly a man changed into an ape man, similar to how lycanthropy works. She told me I was crazy, but it was just an idea, and it would have explained why the monster was wearing pants. My Aunt Betty said she saw a monster once along the highway when driving out to visit us one time. She claimed it was a long snake, but that it was walking along the edge of the road on 4 very long legs, located at the very center of the creature. We all quizzed her at length about this sighting on the day she claimed it happened, and she said the legs on the creature alone had to have been 5 or 6 feet tall. The snake itself was said to have been as thick as a big old oak tree, and its length was so long that she really couldn't even calculate. It was several times the length of her car, and she never actually saw the monster all in one view. It was just too long. 2 different kids at my school had claimed to have seen a creature sort of like a minotaur, That's not what they called it. They called it the ugly-faced giant, but it sounded like a big man with a bull head to me, like in the old Greek fables. Now, I never saw any of these things, but I believed the stories when they were told to me. After a while, I began to feel left out, and by the time I was 18 or 19, I began to start to think that they had all just made these stories up. After all, chimeras don't exist, and nuclear radiation kills. It doesn't make monsters like in the old 1950s movies. I was starting to become an adult, and I was starting to distance myself from the urban legends of my youth. None of those stories were true because none of them could be true. That's how I felt. And then, one day, I saw something that changed my mind about absolutely every aspect of my life. On that one fateful day, I saw the Dogman. I don't just mean I saw a large dog. I don't just mean that I saw an out-of-place animal. I mean, I saw a big, gray, shaggy dog that had to have been my height at its shoulder when it was standing on all fours. I saw that monster dog walking alongside my car in my own driveway. It had come out of my backyard, walked up my driveway, past my car, towering over it, and then it walked out onto the front sidewalk before my house. A car drove by as it emerged, and the driver seemed to panic, beeping the car horn at it to warn it not to come near. The dog rose up on its hind feet in response to the car and its loud beeping, and I saw that thing take a few steps bipedally toward the vehicle as though it were going to attack it. My heart almost stopped, and I choked on my own gasping. I was really afraid I was about to witness something horrible. But that driver hit the gas and managed to avoid crashing into the big Dogman. I watched the immense creature chase the car down the road and out of my view. I was so grateful not to have witnessed a car crash instigated by Dogman right outside my property that I collapsed into a chair and I couldn't move for the next 10 or 20 minutes. I think I might have been suffering a bit from the shock of finally seeing my own impossible monster right there in the shadow of those legendary nuclear towers. But I hadn't seen some sort of mutation like the others. I hadn't seen a chimera, or a minotaur, or a lizard man, or a four-legged snake. Nope. I had seen, with my own eyes, the 3 Mile Island Dogman. Stay tuned, we've got another all-new Dogman story coming up right after this.
I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279.
The big cat tracks that weren't. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story that happened to me back in the 1990s in Wisconsin. My wife and I had just bought an old converted ranch house with a few acres of land to try to begin our family in. We never did have any children, but I suppose that's another story. Most of the land that had been attached to that ranch was cut up into smaller plots and sold off, but we still had a bit of distance between ourselves and our closest neighbors. We'd have to walk for a good 5 or 10 minutes before we could even see their house off in the distance. We had both been city dwellers before that, and my wife never adjusted to a single one of the new jobs that come with being a homeowner. In fact, she kept acting like we had a superintendent, but now the superintendent was me. She never lifted a finger to help take care of the house or property, but she would throw fits if something wasn't working well enough to please her. I might never have come to understand what a narcissist she was if we hadn't moved to that house, so I suppose I'm grateful. I might have been locked into 20 or more years of raising kids with a woman who can't see past the end of her own nose and is convinced that everything is about her. But none of that stuff happened thanks to the Dogman. I remember the first snowy day we had out there. It was so beautiful, but I knew I was going to have to shovel the car out so that we could get places. I got up early and got to work shoveling, not bothering to wake my wife. I had figured out already that she would view herself as too important to perform manual labor. Not only was I right, but she behaved worse than my most dour prediction of how she might act. "I can't believe this is happening to me," she idiotically shouted to her imaginary mental audience of a million versions of herself. I wondered what was happening to her, and I ran over to save her from whatever horrible thing it was. Nothing was happening to her. Nothing at all. I asked her what was up, and she mocked me for not understanding her great torture. I looked around. It was a peaceful morning. It was sunny. It had snowed overnight, and I was shoveling the snow. She was just standing there. Again, I asked her what was the emergency she needed rescuing from. "I'm going to be late for my day," she shouted as though I was really supposed to give a crap. "Well, then you should have gotten up early like I did to shovel the car out, shouldn't you have?" I asked her. I was just incredulous at her narcissism. I had never seen anything like it. But she was only getting warmed up. Now, while I was shoveling, I heard her on the phone to her stupid friends, telling them that I was a bad husband and that I had deliberately trapped her, deliberately made her late for her meeting with them. And then, on top of that, she told them I had raised my voice at her. I had never raised my voice at her, but when I would correct her or point out that she was once again being a selfish jerk, she would refer to that as me yelling at her or raising my voice at her. She would then launch into a long speech about how she was not just a great and suffering martyr and victim, but that she was the longest suffering and most victimized victim of all time. And, in the quote-unquote minds of this woman and her value-free friends, the one who was the greatest victim was the most important person in the world. And the most important person in the world, because they had been so unfairly victimized, was now allowed to completely disregard any rules of fairness or decorum or honesty. This victim was now allowed to smear, belittle, lie about, and attempt to ruin every aspect of the life of anyone who dared not recognize their saintly, holy victimhood. They're insane, and they're clearly possessed by demons. Human beings don't act like that, as it's antithetical to life itself. Human beings want to survive, but people like the woman I was married to back then want to luxuriate in the suffering of others. They want to take every good moment and sour it. They want to take a fun time and claim it's a bad time, that they've been victimized by the happiness, and of course, they always want to lay the blame for them having ruined your life on you. They call you toxic. So, I spent a lot of time outdoors in those days. I would try to get outside anytime she was home. Nature could get cold, but nature never whines, and nature never gaslights, and nature never manipulates you out of your own happiness for no possible good reason. Nature, in short, is natural. The woman I was married to back then, in short, was not. So one day, when I was outside avoiding pointless and unnecessary misery at the hands of a self-destructive narcissist, I noticed animal tracks. Big ones. I took them to be the tracks of a big cat. In my mind's eye, I saw a tiger, but in truth, I suppose a man-eater-sized cat in America would be more likely to be melanistic, dark in other words. Both dogs and cats let loose here, will tend to get darker over the course of a few generations of breeding, according to what has been observed of roaming dog gangs. I'm not sure science wants to admit this is even happening, so I don't know what an official scientific reason for this would be. But that's what the witnesses report seeing. The often discredited witnesses. That's how it seems to go for large cats in the wild of urbanized countries. They tend to be large and black, or very dark. So I made friends with my neighbors on 3 sides so that I could talk to them about what I had found, and so that I could show them the photos I had taken of the very large tracks. I held my hand next to the track in one photo so that they could see that they were larger than my hand and had belonged to a very big animal. One of my neighbors, who had lived among nature for his entire life, told me that this was not the track of a big cat I was showing him. He said it was a dogman track. He said it outright, just like that, dogman. He didn't say this is an enlarged canine track, or this might be from an oversized wolf, or anything like that. He said it was a track of dogman. I asked him a question that seemed very logical to me at the time. I asked him, "What's a dogman?" Well, he gave me a bit of an education, and he gave me a lot to think about. I went home, where my wife was throwing a fit that I hadn't made anything for dinner, and I hadn't told her I was going to be out. She went on after that, but I stopped listening to her. It was somewhere in the middle of that rant when I decided I was not going to live with her anymore. I was going to need to hire a lawyer, and I was going to need to divorce her. But I had to deal with the dogman first. Unlike my wife, I actually had to deal with my reality. I couldn't blame other people for it because, unlike her, I'm ethical and sane. I remember I took the Pop-Tarts I was going to have for dinner out of the toaster, and she grabbed them from my hands, asking me if that was the best I could do to make her dinner. I looked into her eyes, and I saw the ugliest woman that has ever lived. She made me want to puke on her, and she would have deserved it, but something distracted me from outside. It was a large dog, standing on all 4s by the edge of the woods. I ran to the window to get a better look, and the creature seemed alarmed by my movements. It was looking directly at me. It could see me clearly in the window frame, and I could see it. I think the wildebeest I was married to was still bellowing behind me, but I had listened to her enough for one lifetime, and I was ignoring her like the squawking porker she was. All of my attention was on the huge dog I was seeing out there, maybe 90 or 100 feet from the window. It was dusk, but it was still bright enough out that I could see it clearly. It was agitated by the attention it was receiving from me, and the dog stood up on its hind legs, using one of its front paws to balance itself on a tree. Chills went through me as the angry dog thing made this long, barking, howl kind of a sound. I didn't know what that meant, but it sounded like a threat. I turned to say something about the howling to my wife, but she literally had not heard it over the sound of her own yammering. I tried to speak to her, but she turned her eyes upward and started spouting gibberish, talking louder and faster than I spoke so that she couldn't hear me. She had a big smile on her monster face because she thought I was paying attention to her again. I was, in fact, trying to draw her attention to the man-eating monster outside. She was far too important to listen to anything I was saying, and I recognized that some of her gibberish involved her whining that she never gets to use the car because of me. I went over to where we keep the car keys, and I went to hand them to her. She reached out to accept them, and then I pulled my hand back and began walking toward the front door of the house. Soon, we were both standing outside in front of the front door, and she had still not shut up for even 1 second. She was now telling me that she was going to tell the police that I had hit her. "Take the car keys," I said. "Take the car, too. Keep it. Use it to drive out of my life." I threw the keys out into the snow, locked the door from inside so that she couldn't get back in, and then I went upstairs to a window that would give me a decent view of the entire scene. I watched for hours as she tried to find the keys and tried to avoid the dogman. She almost got into the car 2 different times, but the dogman prevented her both times. I watched the greatest battle since the Christians had been thrown to the lions in Rome that evening. I watched as my dearly beloved got at least some of what was coming to her. I toasted her memory with some brandy. I thanked the dogman from the bottom of my heart, and then I went to sleep. In the morning, I called the authorities to say I couldn't find my wife anywhere in the house. They found her, or most of her, strewn all about the property. She was declared the victim of an animal attack, finally fulfilling her goal to be the greatest victim in the world. And I was a free man. When I think of how, if I had gotten her pregnant, I would have stood by that horrible tyrant of a monster until our child or children were grown. When I think of the decades of literal torture I narrowly avoided, I say thank you all over again to the greatest ally I probably ever had in my life. I say thank you to the dogman. It's the wolf moon, and they say this is the most dangerous moon of the year. The wolf moon is not only supposed to be the strongest in terms of turning humans into werewolves, but it's said to have the power to attract multiple werewolves all to the same location. That appears to be exactly what was witnessed one night by 2 young men out in the frigid January woods of Pennsylvania. This story was sent in anonymously by one of you, and the author alleges that it's a true account. So, join us in your imagination as we go back in time years and decades to the late 1970s to a little place called Frogtown in Pennsylvania. It was in the woods to the west of that town that our 2 protagonists encountered the wolf moon werewolves. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have recently become friends again out of the blue with an old friend from my teenage years. I never encountered him on social media before, and to be honest, I thought he had passed on years ago. So, to some extent, it's been like hanging out with a ghost from Christmas past for me. Eventually, we got around to talking about the time we saw a bunch of werewolves on a freezing night in January under a full and bright wolf moon. First of all, let's call my buddy Jethro. Back then, my father used to call us Homer and Jethro, and I didn't know why. My mother told me it was the name of a country music comedy duo, and I still didn't understand because Jethro and I liked rock music. This was the late 1970s after all. Mom told me it was the way my friend and I dressed. We would both wear old wrecked overalls that had been our mutual uniform since we were younger. I guess my father thought overalls were funny. So anyway, call me Homer and my friend will be Jethro to honor my late father's weird sense of humor. The town we both lived in was called Frogtown, and to be completely honest, we had good childhoods and we were both pretty happy guys. We liked to spend our time in the woods, and I guess we weren't ever very productive, but we were friendly and we never hurt anybody, unless you consider trespassing as hurting somebody, because that is something we did quite often back then. The woods past town were pretty thick, but there were also fancy buildings located here and there in the deepest seeming parts. I don't remember if we were ever clear on what those buildings were exactly, so we mostly tried to steer clear of them. However, there's one particular landmark that plays an important part in our story today. I'm talking about the radio station. I don't really know what it actually was, but it looked like an old-fashioned radio station complete with transmitter tower. We thought it was abandoned sometimes, then other times we'd see cars parked outside of it. I don't know if it was privately owned or military or what. I looked it up on the internet, and although I can see it on Google Maps, they don't label it as anything and there's no street view. Still, there's a tall tower that looks like a radio transmitter in the middle of those woods, and the story that I'm going to tell you took place in the shadow of that tower. It was in a dirt clearing near there, but not on the property itself. My friend Jethro and I had been out all day in the snow. We liked weather, all kinds of weather, because staying home for either of us meant being made to do chores or being lectured about getting a job. So we learned to dress warmly and we stayed out of doors as much as humanly possible. That day, as on most other weekend days, we had been out in the woods in the snow since breakfast. It was starting to get dark, and so we headed back toward Jethro's mom's house. She would usually microwave us something fast for dinner. Then we could go to my house and get my mom to heat us up some leftovers by telling her we hadn't had dinner yet. Only, we got sidetracked on the way to Jethro's mom's place that night. Sidetracked by the Dogman. Like I said before, we were right near that tall radio transmitter tower. We would use it as a landmark to guide us at night for obvious reasons. We were not on the property of that tower, but we could see it in the background as we peered through some bushes and got halted in our path. There, on the other side of that shrubbery, stood a tall, freakish-looking man. At least I thought at first that it was a man. Both Jethro and I pulled quietly back into the bush so that we could remain where we were and study this figure until we knew what we were looking at. We had encountered illegal farmers and other nefarious activity at night in remote locations before. We had learned to go silent and sit back observing. It was a tactic that had kept us alive. So, on this night, we found ourselves staring at the back of a tall, white, or gray-covered man. I couldn't understand what he was wearing. The leggings seemed extraordinarily thin and tight, while the top was nothing of the sort. The night was very bright, under the full moon, yet it was very hard for me to take the information my eyes were receiving and turn it into useful information. The man seemed rather top-heavy and bent over at the shoulder. I wasn't sure exactly how he managed to stay balanced on those two spindly legs. Then he turned his head and upper body a bit to the left to gaze at something off in the distance, and I got so much more information in that one split second. It was almost like my mind overloaded and crashed. This is because in that moment, when the creature turned to its left, I could see that it had the head of a light gray canine, like a wolf or a dog. I could also see that the upper torso of the entity was far more like a dog than like a human being. The ribs were so pronounced, and the belly so thin. It was a wolf-like creature, very light in color, at least under the moon, and it was walking about delicately on its hind legs. Jethro and I looked at each other in amazement, then stared back at the upright walking wolf. It wandered to a spot by a tree, then settled into a normal lying on the ground sort of position for a wolf or a dog. You know, sort of sphinx-like with its belly on the ground and its head held up high. It surprised us by rearing its head back and howling loudly straight up into the sky. I thought it was yelling at us, that it had discovered us. Jethro grabbed me hard and held me in place, otherwise I might have taken off running in panic, and given away our location. Off, in the distance, I could hear the howl being returned, and I wondered if we would get to see another one of these wolves. If we did, I wondered if it would walk like this one, or if it would just be more like a regular dog. One thing was for certain. Jethro and I had forgotten about dinner. When there was a chance to see weird stuff happening, we could go without food for days. Remember, we were still very young, and young people think they're invulnerable and immortal. Jethro started making hand motions, which at first I didn't understand. Eventually, I started sussing out that he had the intention of cutting around to another bush to get a different view than the one we had right there. I didn't want him to separate from me, but it became a moot point anyway as a second creature happened upon the scene. This second animal was a dark brown dog or wolf, but it was the size of a fully grown grizzly bear. It walked into the clearing on all fours and probably was almost 6 feet tall at the shoulder, I would guess. All of Jethro's hopes of getting up and moving around were dashed as the beast was just too large to chance getting closer to. Once it saw the first wolf, the lighter-colored one, it reared back on its hind legs in much the way a bear would. The smaller one jumped up and down happily as they were apparently familiar with each other. Clearly the larger one was the alpha, and the smaller one submitted most enthusiastically. Both of them were standing bipedally, which I found pretty amazing and impressive. They both settled down onto the ground and howled up into the night. My heart was beating faster and faster. I knew it was getting increasingly dangerous to be where we were, but how could we leave? How could we not wait to see what would happen next? The two of them howling was like something that put you into another world, a trance, or something hypnotic. I'm not sure what to compare it to since I've never been hypnotized. I felt something change in my ears, like when you go up or down a high-speed elevator. I don't really know how else to describe or explain it. The vibration of my body seemed to alter to match the vibration of their howling, which was much more powerful than any sound would normally feel. It was almost as though it were a giant hand, and it grabbed me around my entire chest all at once. They both stopped howling and were met by multiple responses in several different directions. This seemed to please the smaller one, who was very excited and fidgety. The larger, darker dogman rested regally, displaying patience and a quiet sense of power. Soon, the woods were alive with upright walking animals of all different kinds, appearing from all different directions. They each walked bipedally, although some dropped to all fours or to seated positions in front of the dogs, which clearly ranked higher within the tribe. It seemed as though they all knew each other, although some were more social and others held back from the center of activity. I also noticed that this was not just a gathering of the upright walking wolf-type creatures. There were really ugly things present too. They didn't even resemble dogs at all, but they were hairy, and they walked upright like men. So horrifying was the image of the 3 ugly creatures we saw there that night that Jethro and I used to draw them as our own cartoon characters from then on. We called them the Uglies, and we drew them to feel a sense of power over them. They were more frightening to us than the larger dogmen. They were just so disgusting to see. I can't even explain it. We also saw wolfmen that night. What I mean to say is, we saw hairy creatures with a man-like body, but a dog-like head. They had broad shoulders, and they held their arms to their sides like men. I was curious who would prove to be the dominant type, the upright walking canids, or the dog-headed men. While I saw some of them pass each other in the clearing, I could not tell if either side was displaying any submissive postures at all. Possibly these are two tribes that choose to exist side by side without either displaying dominance over the other? If so, that would be extremely rare behavior for canine-type creatures. Then again, walking on your hind legs is also very rare behavior for canines. Jethro had a dumb look on his face. I hated when he would get that look. He was grinning, and if you're in the middle of a gathering of dogmen and werewolves, grinning is sort of the last thing you should be doing. I shook my head no at him, even though I had no idea what his plan was yet. He shook his head yes back at me, then picked up a pebble off the ground. I made a no sign with my mouth and with my hands, but Jethro just did not care. "Let's get 'em to fight with each other," he snorted and chuckled. The sound of him saying that instantly stopped all the activity in our vicinity, and every single one of the dogmen, werewolves, and ugly whatevers all stopped what they were doing and turned to stare directly in our direction. Still giggling stupidly, Jethro reared back to throw his rock into the group of dogmen. Even before releasing the small stone, I saw Jethro's eyes widen as he realized he had the rapt attention of every single one of the large, carnivorous, mythical beasts. He let go of the rock, and it went a few feet before dribbling to a halt. Even before it stopped rolling, both Jethro and I were running. We were running away from where we needed to get to. This path would not take us to Jethro's mom's home for a microwaved snack. This path would not take us to my home for leftovers. This path was just taking us deeper into the snow-covered forest at night. If you've ever been outside at night in January, then you know how your breath turns to smoke in front of your face. If you've had to run any distance in the cold, you know how your breath can turn to ice on your face, especially if you got some days of razor stubble. Now, if you've ever done these things on a cold night below freezing while weeping hysterically and crying, you will know the sensations that my buddy Jethro and I were experiencing as we attempted to not trip and not twist our ankles while we ran through the trees and snows and mud and crevices and hills, hearing what had to be over a dozen dogmen howling behind us as we ran. I could also hear them coming after us. I could hear the larger ones barking at us in a vicious and frightening manner. I could hear the smaller ones yapping at us. I remember thinking that the smaller ones were only as tall as I was, and I wept much harder, understanding that there was a good chance we might not make it home safely that night. Jethro said something to me, but I didn't understand him, and I was gasping for air so desperately that I wouldn't have been able to form words back to him anyway. It was taking more strength to keep going than I knew that I had. I felt like falling down and giving up 10 minutes earlier, yet somehow I was still going. By that point, I was in a lot of pain and sort of listing to one side, but we were both managing to keep going pretty fast. Like I said, youth and invulnerability. We rounded this corner in the woods and ran straight headlong into a park ranger right there out of nowhere. He started getting angry with us, telling us to slow down and so forth. I don't remember what Jethro did, but I collapsed to my knees and just hoped this guy could protect us. I couldn't run any further. I couldn't speak. I could barely even breathe. I turned around to see if any of the dogmen were still following us, and what I saw caused my brain to freeze. There was a walking white sheepdog. There was a walking German shepherd. There was a hairy man with a head like a pug dog. There were other features approaching as well, baring their teeth, growling, salivating at the mouth, and glaring at us through eyes that seemed lit from within. I heard an explosion. Then I must have become unconscious. When I woke up, I was at the ranger station, which was lit with harsh fluorescent light. Jethro was next to me, and he signaled for me to keep quiet. We sat there waiting for what seemed like over an hour. Then we were led into this small, messy office. The ranger we had run into in the woods sat behind a desk looking very serious. We took seats before him and he began lecturing us. He told us that we had disturbed a mother bear and that she had pursued us. He told us nothing else had happened other than us coming upon a mother bear who chased us to protect her cubs. We both looked at him like he was crazy. We hadn't seen any bears. He knew what we saw. The ranger slammed his hands on the desk, stood up, and shouted at us, "You got no goddamn idea what you encountered out there, little boys." That shut us up. And what's more, he continued angrily, you don't want to know. Because if you did know, it would cause you to lose your mind. He stood there for a while, letting that sink in, and we sat there silently. When he sat down again, he quietly asked us, "What did you see out there, boys?" And we both quickly replied, "A bear, a mother bear." The ranger smiled and asked us if we needed a lift home. On the drive back, he confided in us. "Boys," he said, "don't ever, but never, stay in the woods after dark on the night of the wolf moon. It's just not safe to be out on such a night." We understood. It was because the legends were true. Under the wolf moon, in January, gather the dogmen. On the nights of the wolf moon, humans need to huddle indoors behind locked windows, for on those nights roam the werewolves, not just singly, but in packs. And that's my story of encountering the wolf moon werewolves. I've got two really strange Dogman stories today. I mean, really odd and weird. No amount of introduction is going to make them less weird. So let's jump right into this first one, which is called Dream Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have dreamed of the Dogman since I was very young. I didn't realize that it was Dogman I was dreaming about, though, until I met him in real life. Going back to when I was very young, I used to have what I would call running dreams. In those dreams, I would run, hence the name. I would run through nature. I would run through forests. I would run up mountains and into caves and all around the other world that exists beneath us. I could run effortlessly and never grow tired, and I could run as fast as a cheetah or a lion. I felt like I had as much strength as I needed. I was incredibly potent and powerful. Running was so effortless in these dreams, it was almost like flying. I could take the time to look at all the things I was running or flying past. I could really enjoy my trip while also traveling at incredible rates of speed. I would see plants, I would see rocks, dirt, water, and I could feel the wind on me, but I would never see animals, and I would never see people. The dreams weren't lonely, though, because I would always be running with my good friend. I didn't see the friend, but I knew he was there, and I was always happy to be back with him. It was that pure feeling of true and deep friendship that you used to be able to feel when you were a kid, when you could love someone without question and know that they would always feel the same back to you. It's nothing that an adult would be able to feel anymore, or at least nothing an adult could expect from life or believe in. But when you're a kid, friendship is more real than anything else. The friendship in my running dreams felt like my deepest and most original of all friendships. It felt like my original friendship, and it felt like going home. One night, something happened that changed this all permanently. I woke up in bed at some point during the night. My bed was directly next to a window looking out on our backyard and the mythic woods of my childhood beyond it. Those woods were always where my dreams would start. Because of the ground sloping downward to the left, my window was 8 or 9 feet off the ground, even though the head of my bed would probably have been only 3 or 4 feet up. Still, I liked having the window up higher because it meant I could look out, but nobody outside was going to be looking in on me. That night, when I woke up and I looked out that window, someone was standing there looking back in at me. There stood, on its hind legs, the largest and most horrifying dog I had ever seen. Its fur was messy and tangled with death. I could smell it through the window. The figure was visible from its hairy chest to the top of its pointed, standing dog ears. It had a head that at first reminded me of a boar or a wild pig, but the teeth were more like that of a wolf or a wild dog. In other words, it had the head of a 4-legged animal, but that head was on top of a humanoid chest, and it had to be 10 or 11 feet tall to be standing there the way it was. I felt unable to move. I was so frightened. I wondered if the creature were doing this to me, but then I saw this look in its strange eyes that gave me a sense of déjà vu. It was as though I knew that feeling or emotion that the animal-headed beast man was trying to convey. Don't ask me how I knew, but I understood somehow that this hideous, horrible-looking giant monster thing outside my window was in fact my friend that I ran with so often in my dreams. I knew from its eyes, I knew from the sad look that it wanted me to come run with him again. I felt like crying myself as I wanted to run with my friend as well. But if my friend was this monster, I would be too scared to run with him. As though sensing my fear, the dog man grew stressed and seemed angry. It bared its teeth at me, which I took to be a threat. He was my friend because I had been his friend. If I were now to fear him, he would follow his instinct and treat me as prey. But he looked so frightening. I couldn't think of him as a friend. I could only fear him. I tried to scream for help, but found that I couldn't. I wanted to run away, but it was impossible. And then, while still staring at me angrily, the dogman just disappeared. I mean, right in front of my eyes, he faded out, but pretty fast. I ran to my parents, and they both got very short with me and told me it was a dream. I asked if I could stay with them, and they said no. I had to go back to my cold bedroom alone, and I had to try to sleep in that bed that the dogman had just been outside of. I found it hard to sleep that night, and I was a wreck the next day. I found it hard to sleep the next night too, and the next night, and the next, and the next. Soon I was being taken to see shrinkologists and shrinkiatrists, and I was given all sorts of prescriptions and therapies. I just got used to sleeping for very short periods. I got used to having fewer dreams than most people. I started sleeping more like a cat. A few hours, then get up, then another few hours. I have too deep and too real a fear of my running friend to let myself sink into deep sleep. This is the way I grew up. In my early 20s, I enjoyed some success, and I had a serious girlfriend. It looked like I had my problems and my demons under control, but obviously I did not. I managed to ruin my business and my relationship. I figured out how to wreck my own success and become homeless. One night, there was a conflict between me and some worker for the city, and I ended up getting sent to a mental hospital. It was that or prison, and the choice was easy. Being locked up in a hospital by the government is even scarier than going there willingly on your own. They look at you like you're their lab rat, and the truth is that you are. I was more terrified in there than I had ever been, but they gave me something that really knocked me out and let me sleep. Most of the other times I had been drugged into sleeping, it was a dreamless rest. Not so with whatever they gave me that time. I did nothing but dream. I dreamed all night, and I kept on dreaming during the day. It was a harsh medication, but it was what I needed at that point in time. The running dreams returned. On that medication, nothing seemed scary. Everything seemed too much to get upset over, or else it seemed loopy and funny. I was able to look right at my friend and witness all his ferocity, all the horror of this giant dog thing's existence, and I was able to feel toward him that same original feeling of unequivocal friendship that we all used to be able to feel when we were young. I was able to accept that he was a monster and that he could end my story with a number of exclamation marks anytime he got hungry enough, and yet I was able to feel the exhilaration of his presence and the sheer joy of the run. I knew that if I showed fear for even 1 second, it could mean the end of me. And yet, on that stuff the nurses gave me, the idea of fear was laughable. As I got less insane and my sentence at the facility drew to a close, I realized I would need to find a way to live with no fear, to stay in that sense of joy without using the extreme meds I'd used at the hospital. I was going to have to find a way to change my outlook so that I could stare fear in the face without having to be hopped up on goofballs. The rest of my story is one of me seeking out wisdom teachers and learning about different systems of meditation and spirituality. I gravitated towards some teachers, both ancient and modern, that could, I guess, be generally referred to as Zen. That's what I found works for me. It might not be what works for you, but I know there is something that will if you seek it. For once you get past fear, once you take joy even in danger and horror, once you are comfortable with yourself in every situation, that is when you can run. You can run with the Dogman. Don't go anywhere. We've got another Dogman story right now. The 2-foot-tall elf and the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story that happened to me a long time ago in a wild place about a 20-minute drive from Chatham, New Jersey. The Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. This is an awesome place to go, especially if you have kids. There are classes of all sorts and guided tours on wooden boardwalks built directly into the wilderness. I had brought my son there when he was 7, I think. He's a grown man now with a boy of his own, to give you an idea of how long ago this all went down. We happened to be walking around town one day years later when he would have been, I guess, 13 or 14, and we discovered that the wildlife refuge actually extends all the way to Chatham. We had driven 20 minutes to get to the other end of it, unaware we could just walk into the closer end of it randomly, and a part of town we never had need to be in before. I would urge any of you in the area to visit this wildlife refuge. You'll learn a whole lot about New Jersey if you do. The only precautions I would urge is that you get out while the sun is still shining, and that you keep an eye out for mythical creatures. My son and I had wandered out of suburban Chatham back in time, thousands of years or longer. At least that's what it felt like, and we both made statements to that effect. We hadn't expected to be in nature 5 minutes earlier, and we were both stunned at how little we knew about our own town and a wildlife refuge that we had actually already been to. There was a feeling in the air like anything could happen, and so, of course, it did. My son asked me if I saw that small man. I looked where he pointed and felt such a shock that my chest clenched up a bit. I held onto a tree and looked again. What I saw was a small man dressed like he was going to the Renaissance fair, but holding two small devices that emitted blue glows. The man was probably about 2.5 or 3 feet tall. He looked directly at us, and I was doubly shocked to see that his eyes were very black. I don't mean to say that he looked like a space alien. It was more as though he looked like a deer in the headlights. His eyes had hardly any white around the edges. He was all iris, fully open in the dark. He looked surprised and frightened to see us there, and he looked down at one of his devices, fiddling with it for a while. I don't remember why, but I lost interest in the small man, and my son had to grab me and shout at me that he was getting away. I felt confused, but followed my son as he chased the small humanoid. At least I assumed that's what we were running after. It was all I could do just to keep up with my son. We reached a clearing, with what appeared to be a cave entrance on the other side of that clearing. As we did so, lightning and thunder crashed down, and the sky became very dark very quickly. My son pointed excitedly and told me that the small man was heading into the cave entrance. I looked, and I saw a small, blue, glowing figure running inside the cave. It was not the same figure I had seen earlier. In fact, it was far smaller and thinner and glowed uniformly from head to toe in that same blue color that had emanated from the prior one's handheld device. After he went inside the cave entrance, we both ran across that clearing after him. I felt like the situation had gotten out of my control. I was supposed to be the father, and yet here I was allowing my son to set the agenda. I could just say no. His mother certainly wouldn't want him chasing fairies or elves or space aliens or whatever it was that we found ourselves chasing. Why had I not put my foot down? Something was having an effect on me that had not bothered my son. Maybe whatever that elf did on his device put my mind into such a cloud that my son was now thinking faster than I was. Something told me that there was a problem here that I was not fully aware of or focused on. I knew I should be saying something to my son, and yet, instead, I was just still running after him, running toward that cave entrance that no sane father would allow his son to be running toward. And then, we were there, at the entrance to the cave. I was out of breath and couldn't speak, gasping for air. I grabbed a hold of my son's arm and held him tight while I caught my breath. He was telling me he saw where the little man went, but when I was able to look up and squint into the entrance, I saw nothing but blackness. I mean, it was just freakishly, unnaturally dark inside that cave. I should have been able to see more than I was seeing. Have you ever had anything like that happen to you? Nope, me neither. But that's what was happening to me as I looked into that supposed cave. Lightning lit the sky, and thunder crashed loudly, making us both jump. I said it was time for us to go home. He protested, saying that we had discovered a new species, and that we had an obligation to science to bring him back alive, and other nonsense like that. I grabbed his wrist and told him it was unsafe and we were going home right away. I took a step away from the cave entrance and he resisted me, but I knew he wasn't strong enough to resist me for long. Thunder and lightning crashed down, though, surprising me and causing me to loosen my grip long enough for my son to break away. Of course he headed straight into the cave entrance, and I followed as closely on his heels as I could manage. I found that once inside, I could see in the cave. There were what looked like tunnel entrances carved out of the stone, and my son ran toward one of them, with me close behind. As we neared the rough doorway in the stone, a figure appeared, blocking our path. It was not the small man we had seen earlier. This one was so tall, it filled the entire doorway from top to bottom and side to side. It was dark gray and hairy, with dog ears on top of its head, and it stood like a man. Its eyes reflected back a yellow glow, and my first thought was, Bigfoot with a dog head. My second thought didn't come till much later, as that dog man got right in our faces in the most literal of ways. and it kind of barked and screamed at us all at the same time. My son immediately took off running, but I was so stunned by this occurrence I found myself frozen to the spot, screaming in a very high-pitched voice. They say you never know if you have heroism and courage inside yourself until you're put to a test. Well, I met the Dogman, and I screamed like a baby girl. There was a lot of running, there was a lot of screaming, but there were no injuries and we both got out of there in one piece. I was far more shaken up than my son, who seemed to think he had just been on a thrill ride. It was almost as if he wanted to go back there again. To this day, he loves to tell this story at family gatherings, the time Dad screamed like a little girl. Thanks, son. We got home, and of course my wife didn't believe either of us. My son wanted to take her back, but I said it could wait till a day that wasn't so stormy. My wife insisted there had been no thunderstorms all that afternoon. She pointed out that the sky was bright and sunny. I hadn't noticed that until she pointed it out, but she was correct. A few weeks later, my son insisted on bringing his mother back to see where the Dogman and the alien had been, and of course I came along. We couldn't find the cave. There is no cave in that wilderness refuge as far as I know. I have no idea what we saw on that day, as we weren't even able to relocate the clearing it took place in. How much of what happened that day happened in our minds? And how much happened in reality? And what is reality anyway? You'd be asking these questions yourself if you had met the 2-foot-tall elf and the Dogman. Hey, it's me, Henry Lee Dogman, here to thank those of you who support all of us here at Scary Stories NYC. It really helps us if you click like, and if you forward our videos or leave cool comments. If you can, it helps us even more when you let us share our 25-episode and growing collection of uncensored, scary Dogman stories with you by becoming a paid subscriber at peterbernard.com. That's right, join our monthly club and get 25 stories right off the bat, each of them wilder than what we're allowed to tell you on this channel. Then, each Sunday, get another new scary story, usually a Dogman story, but always uncensored and secret, available nowhere else on the planet. Please consider joining us today at peterbernard.com and keep the scary stories coming. Thanks, everyone.
If you enjoyed this, please click like or consider subscribing. Remember to click the bell icon or you won't get notifications. If you want to listen to Bigfoot's secret uncensored story each Sunday, just go to peterbernard.com and become a paid subscriber. See you tomorrow. Same dog time, same dog channel.
Come back for more scary stories.